Chapter 2: The Motorcycle Diaries. Guevara's South American Odyssey. Ernesto loved to travel. His father wrote that with time he came to understand. His obsession with traveling was just another part of his zeal for learning. Guevara 1995. 2. However, Ernesto disguised this motivation for his early trips by talking casually about his travel plans, and by at least pretending to be motivated primarily by the desire for adventure. His diary of his now famous 1951-1952 trip, Guevara 1995, throughout South America, is written primarily in this vein. However, his subsequent 1953-1954 trip throughout South and Central America was clearly motivated by more serious intentions, especially after he reached Central America. See Chapter 3. Ernesto's first noteworthy journey on his own took place in 1950, when he toured all of central and northern Argentina by motorbike. A trip of some 4,000 miles, Gambini 1968-22. He was 21 and a medical student at the University of Buenos Aires at the time. On his journey, he stopped off in Córdoba to visit his friends Tomás and Alberto Granado. Alberto was conducting research on lepers at a leprosarium near San Francisco del Chañar. And because Ernesto was intrigued by Alberto's research, he spent several days with Alberto at the leprosarium. 20 CheGuevara. From there, he headed north and met an interesting assortment of hobos, vagabonds, seasonal workers, poor indigenous inhabitants, and other socially marginalized people along the way. He often stayed overnight in police stations and provincial hospitals, where he asked if he could sleep in vacant jail cells or empty hospital beds. As a result, for the first time in his adult life, Ernesto witnessed the harsh duality of his country by crossing the divide from its transported European culture, which was also his culture, and its ignored, backward indigenous heartland. Anderson 1997, 63. What he learned from this trip to the poorer northern region of his country was that Argentina's more modern and superficial European culture was a luxurious facade under which the country's true soul lay, and that soul was rotten and diseased. It was from this region of the country that the Argentine Indians, commonly referred to as Coyas, and the mixed-blood Cabecitas Negras, little blackheads, fled in steadily increasing numbers, pouring into the cities in search of work, and setting up shanty towns like the one in front of the Guevara's home in Córdoba. Anderson 1997, 64. They were the social class of domestic servants and day laborers called descamisados, shirtless ones, whom Perón and his wife Evita promised to incorporate into the nation, and whom Argentina's white elite still exploit and despise. When Ernesto returned to Buenos Aires from this trip, he took the motorbike back to the store, where he bought it in order to have it reconditioned. When the store owner discovered the details of the trip, he was astounded and asked Ernesto to give him a letter attesting to his having made such a fantastic trip, using the particular brand of motorbike that he used. This letter, along with a picture of Ernesto sitting on his motorbike, was published in a local sports magazine as an advertisement for this type of motorbike. Tabo 1996, 35. Ernesto returned to his studies in medical school, resumed playing rugby, and continued working in Dr. Pisani's clinic. He also fell in love for the first time. The object of his affection was the 16-year-old daughter of one of Córdoba's wealthiest families. Her name was Maria del Carmen Chichina Ferreira, and they met in October 1950 at a wedding in Córdoba, attended by Ernesto and his family. By all accounts, she was a strikingly beautiful, intelligent, and charming young woman, who was as infatuated with him as he was with her. Tabo, 37. However, this row the Motorcycle Diaries 21 Mance was doomed from the start, since Chichina was a pampered young princess from the blue-blooded Argentina gentry, heiress to the Ferreira family empire, while Ernesto was the bohemian prodigal son of a family of pauperized aristocrats, who after generations of decline were at best precarious members of Argentina's upper middle class. Anderson 1997, 65. Chichina's family lived in an imposing French-style chateau with park-like gardens in Córdoba, and on a large estate called La Malegno outside of the city. According to her cousin, Dolores Moyano, This estate included 2 Polo Phi Elds, Arabian stallions, and a feudal village of workers for the family's limestone quarries. The family visited the village church every Sunday for Mass, worshipping in a separate alcove to the right of the altar with its own separate entrance and private communion rail, away from the mass of workers. In many ways, La Malegno exemplified everything that Ernesto despised. Yet, unpredictable as always, Ernesto had fallen madly in love with the princess of this little empire, my cousin CheGuevara, an extraordinarily beautiful and charming girl, who, to the dismay of her parents, was equally fascinated by Ernesto. Quoted in Anderson, 65, Ernesto became a frequent, if not always welcome, visitor at the Ferreira's homes in Cordoba and at La Malegno. Ernesto was madly in love with CheGuevara and wanted to marry her, but the differences in their age and social class, her parents' disapproval of him, and the distance between them began to strain their relationship. At the beginning of 1951, Ernesto needed to earn some money, so he signed up to serve as a ship's nurse on Argentina's merchant marine freighters and oil tankers, Tabo 38. Between February and June 1951, he made various trips back and forth between Argentina and Brazil, Venezuela, and the Caribbean islands. These trips gave him plenty of time to study for his medical exams and exposed him to life at sea, as well as most of the ports of call on the Atlantic coast of South America and in the Caribbean. At the end of June 1951, he went back to medical school. On one of his visits to Cordoba to see CheGuevara, he also visited his friends, the Granado brothers. In the course of a conversation with Alberto 22 Guevara Granado while working on his motorcycle, nicknamed La Poderosa, the powerful one, the idea of making a year-long trip together took shape. Ernesto's account of this momentous occasion is as follows. Our fantasizing took us to far-away places, sailing tropical seas, traveling through Asia. And suddenly, slipping in as if part of our fantasy, came the question, why don't we go to North America? North America? How? On La Poderosa, man. That's how the trip came about, and it never deviated from the general principle laid down then, improvisation. My task before leaving was to take as many exams in as many subjects as possible. Alberto's to get the bike ready for the long journey. At that stage, the momentousness of our endeavor hadn't dawned on us. All we could see was the dusty road ahead, and us on our bike devouring kilometers in the FLite northward. Guevara 1995, 13. They were both restless and anxious to set out on an adventure. Alberto had quit his job, and Ernesto was tired of medical school, hospitals, and studying for exams. He was also frustrated by the opposition of CheGuevara's parents to their relationship. For these reasons, they both wanted to take a break from their existing circumstances. Thus, in December 1951, when he lacked only 1 year of receiving his medical degree, Ernesto and his friend Alberto Granados decided to set out to explore all of Latin America by motorcycle. Ernesto's Motorcycle Diaries, Guevara 1995, which were published many years after his death, provide a valuable personal narrative of this journey. They shed light on a little-known period in his young adulthood and provide important insights into his personality and the development of his views about the world. Written while he was traveling around South America in his early 20s, they allow the reader to gain an intimate portrait of him at an important and formative period in his life. Ironically, most of this trip was not made on a motorcycle. In fact, Ernesto and Alberto traveled on just about every mode of transportation available at the time. Horses, railroads, buses, trucks, cars, ships, ferries, boats, rafts, and airplanes, and of course on their feet. After their motorcycle died in Chile, they were forced to walk, hitchhike, and use whatever means was available to make their way from one end of the South American continent to the other. The Motorcycle Diaries, 23 Ernesto's lucid and brief accounts in his diary, enable the reader to almost hear his thoughts, view the world through his eyes, and sense his spirit. In a certain sense, they allow the reader to travel back in time to meet the man before he made his grand entrance on the stage of world history as one of the most charismatic and emblematic revolutionaries of all time. From Buenos Aires, Ernesto and Alberto traveled to the Atlantic coast of Argentina and across the Pampa to the south of Argentina, where they crossed the Andes Mountains into Chile. They had increasing problems with the motorcycle as they traveled over the Andes and through southern Chile. As they neared the Chilean capital of Santiago, the motorcycle finally gave out, and they had to continue the rest of their trip on foot. They also quickly ran out of money. They were forced to panhandle, freeload, and work at numerous odd jobs in order to continue their journey northward through Chile to Peru, through Peru to Colombia, and finally to Venezuela. Along the way, Ernesto developed a critical social consciousness based on the many instances of social injustice, human exploitation, and racial and ethnic discrimination he witnessed in all the countries he visited. He also developed a Latin American identity as he discovered that the people in these countries shared common values, aspirations, and socio-historical conditions. When Ernesto announced his travel plans to his family, they were surprised to learn he planned to be away for a whole year, particularly because of his love affair with CheGuevara, 1995. 1. When his father asked him about her, Ernesto said, "If she loves me, she'll wait." Years later, his father reflected on Ernesto's motivations for this trip in the prologue he wrote for the so-called Motorcycle Diaries. He said he did not understand his son's motivations at the time, and it was only many years later that he realized what truly motivated him. He wrote, "I was puzzled. I didn't understand Ernesto. There were things about him I couldn't quite fathom. They only became clear with time. I didn't realize then that his obsession with traveling was just another part of his zeal for learning. He knew that really to understand the needs of the poor he had to travel the world, not as a tourist stopping to take pretty pictures and enjoy the scenery, but by sharing the human suffering found at every bend in the road." Years later, thinking back over his continuous 24 CheGuevara traveling, I realized that it had convinced him of his true destiny. Guevara, 1995. 2. His father also noted that he was fooled by the very casual manner in which his son talked about his trips, mistakenly assuming he was wily motivated by curiosity and adventure. However, through reading his letters and later his diaries, his father realized his son was following a true missionary impulse which never left him, and possessed a mystical and certain knowledge of his own destiny. Guevara, 1995. 3-4. The choice of the term missionary is somewhat misleading, since Ernesto at this stage was certainly not concerned with propagating a specific ideology or doctrine. He was very open-minded, quite secular in his thinking, and generally respectful of the cultural differences he encountered in his travels. In fact, there is very little evidence of the kind of dogmatism and ethnocentrism in his thinking that one associates with the thinking of most missionaries. His father had to suffer, in silence, the fears he had for his son, when he learned he was planning to take a year away from his studies to go on the incredible transcontinental odyssey he and his friend Alberto Granado had planned. According to his father, when he told me of the journey he planned with Granado, I took him aside and said, "You've some hard times ahead. How can I advise against it when it's something I've always dreamed of myself? But remember, if you get lost in those jungles and I don't hear from you at reasonable intervals, I'll come looking for you, trace your steps, and won't come back until I find you." Guevara, 1995. 3. In response, Ernesto promised his father he would write frequently and keep him informed of his route of travel, which he faithfully did. He and Alberto started out on their journey on January 4, 1952, midsummer in the southern hemisphere. They went far west to the Atlantic coast of Argentina to visit one of Ernesto's uncles in Village Isle, and then to the beach resort city of Miramar to say goodbye to Chichina, who was vacationing there with one of her aunts. Ernesto brought with him a puppy for Chichina, whom he significantly named Come Back. He ended up staying 8 days in Miramar, and the Motorcycle Diaries, 25 Berto was worried he was going to change his mind about going ahead with their trip. Ernesto wrote the following in his diary about this romantic interlude at the outset of their long journey. The trip hung in the balance, in a cocoon, subordinate to the word which consents and ties. Alberto saw the danger and was already imagining himself alone on the highways and byways of America, but he said nothing. The tug of war was between her and me. The 2 days I'd planned stretched like elastic into 8, and with the bittersweet taste of goodbye mingling with my inveterate halitosis, I finally felt myself wafted away on the winds of adventure. Guevara, 1995. 17. In Miramar, He tried to obtain both CheGuevara's promise to wait for him and her gold bracelet as a keepsake to take with him on the trip. She didn't give him either, but she did give him $15 to purchase a scarf for her in the United States, the planned endpoint of their journey. Several weeks later in the Andean mountain resort of Bariloche, Ernesto found a letter from CheGuevara waiting for him at the local post of Phi-C, where they had previously arranged he would pick up his mail. In this letter, she informed him she had decided not to wait for him. In his diary, he wrote the following about his reactions. I read and reread the incredible letter. Suddenly all my dreams of home, bound up with the eyes which saw me off in Muremmer, were shattered, apparently for no good reason. Page 35. Although he was clearly hurt and wanted at Phi Resti to write a weepy letter, he realized it was hopeless to convince her to change her mind. He also wrote, I thought I loved her until this moment when I realized I couldn't feel, I had to think her back again. The next day, Ernesto and Alberto crossed a mountain lake into Chile on a leaking ferry boat that they kept afloat by pumping out the bilge water in return for their free passage. On this boat, they met some Chilean doctors who told them there was a leper colony on Easter Island, Rapa Nui, or Isla de Pascua, some 2,000 miles from mainland Chile in the southeastern Pacific Sea. As Ernesto wrote in his diary, it was a wonderful island, they said, and our scientific sea appetites were whetted. Page 37. They resolved to travel to the island and asked one of the doctors to give 26 CheGuevara them a letter of introduction to the president of the Friends of Easter Island in Valparaiso, where they hoped they could secure passage on a ship going to the island. With their money running low, they were forced to freeload their way through southern Chile. In the southern port city of Valdivia, they dropped in on the local newspaper, which interviewed them for an article about their journey. As a result, they decided in a gesture of great magnanimity to dedicate their trip to the city, since it was celebrating the 400th anniversary of its founding. At their next stop, in the picturesque central Chilean town of Temuco, they were interviewed again by the local newspaper, which was printed under the title, Two Argentine leprology experts tour South America by motorbike, page 40. Ernesto's account in his diary of this article and their short stay in Temuco reveals some of the flavor of their trip at this point, as well as his tongue-in-cheek view of their freeloading style of travel. He wrote, we had asked permission to leave the bike in the garage of a man who lived on the outskirts, and we now made our way there. No longer just a pair of reasonably likable bums with a bike in tow. No, we were now the experts, and that's how we were treated. We spent the day Phi-zing the bike, and a little dark maid kept calming up with edible treats. At 5 o'clock, after a sumptuous snack laid on by our host, we said goodbye to Temuco and headed north. Page 40. They didn't get very far before they noticed their back tire had a puncture that they couldn't fix. They were worried they would have to spend the night in the open, but as Ernesto recounts in his diary, we weren't just anybody now, we were the experts. We soon found a railway worker who took us to his house where we were treated like kings. Page 41. They Phi-zed the tire at a garage the next day and resumed their trip, but they soon encountered more trouble. Without any warning, their motorcycle veered sideways and threw them off. The crash broke the bike's steering column and smashed its gearbox. This was the beginning of the end of La Poderosa. Although they managed to weld the steering column and Phi-X the gearbox at a local garage, the bike was never the same again. The Motorcycle Diaries, 27, while they were working on the bike at this garage, they bummed something to eat and drink at the homes of the curiosity seekers, who dropped by to see the two famous travelers working on their motorcycle. Their last night in Temuco, they were invited by the mechanics at the garage to have drinks with them and go to a village dance, where Ernesto got drunk and caused an altercation on the dance floor. He wrote the following account of this incident in his diary. Chilean wine is very good, and I was downing it at an amazing rate. So by the time we went on to the village dance, I felt ready for anything. One of the mechanics from the garage, a particularly nice guy, asked me to dance with his wife because he'd been mixing his drinks and was the worse for wear. His wife was pretty randy, feeling horny and obviously in the mood. And I, full of Chilean wine, took her by the hand to lead her outside. She followed me docilely, but then realized her husband was watching and changed her mind. I was in no state to listen to reason, and we had a bit of a Barney quarrel in the middle of the dance floor. resulting in me pulling her toward one of the doors with everybody watching. She tried to kick me, and as I was pulling her, she lost her balance and went crashing to the FL. Page 42, he and Alberto had to quickly leave the scene, pursued by a swarm of enraged dancers. Since they had now worn out the hospitality of their local hosts, they left the next day, but only after having lunch at the house of the family that lived next to the garage. On the road north to Santiago, they had another bad spill on the motorcycle, and they had to repair it once again. Shortly thereafter, the bike finale gave its last gasp going up a steep hill, and they had to hitch a lift on a truck going to the town of Los Angeles. They arranged to stay in a volunteer fire station in Los Angeles, and in a few days found a truck to take them and the bike to Santiago, where they left the corpse of La Poderosa at a garage. At this point in their journey, Ernesto noted they ceased being motorized bums and became non-motorized bums. Page 44. From this point forward, they had to rely on their freeloading skills to hitch rides, bum meals and lodgings, work at odd jobs when they could. 28 CheGuevara and panhandle their way northward to Peru. Ernesto noted in his diary their transition to this new stage in their journey. We were used to attracting idle attention with our strange garb and the prosaic figure of La Poderosa Roman II, whose asthmatic wheezing aroused pity in our hosts. All the same, we had been, so to speak, gentlemen of the road. We'd belonged to a time-honored aristocracy of wayfarers, bearing our degrees as visiting cards to impress people. Not anymore. Now we were just two tramps with packs on our backs, and the grime of the road encrusted in our overalls, shadows of our former aristocratic selves. Page 49. They went from Santiago to Valparaiso only to discover there were no ships leaving from this port city to go to Easter Island for another 6 months. While they were in Valparaiso, they made friends with the owner of a bar named La Gioconda, the name of a famous Italian opera and another name for the Mona Lisa painting. The bar owner would not let them pay for their food or drink and even let them sleep in the kitchen. He was fond of saying, "Today it's your turn, tomorrow it'll be mine." Page 51. While they were there, he asked Ernesto to visit one of his elderly customers who was suffering from asthma and a bad heart. Ernesto's comments in his diary about this old woman reveal a great deal about his social views at this stage in his life. He observed that the poor thing was in an awful state, breathing the smell of stale sweat and dirty feet that led her room, mixed with the dust from a couple of armchairs, which were the only luxuries in her house. Page 52. Such circumstances, he said, made a doctor feel powerless and long for change that would end the social injustices of the present order. He noted that in such cases, we see the profound tragedy which circumscribes the life of the proletariat working class the world over, since the poverty of their existence makes them, at the end of their lives, a bitter burden for the poor family members who have to take care of them. His concluding comments were these: "How long this present order, based on an absurd idea of caste, will last I can't say." But he added it was time for governments to spend more money, much more money, funding socially useful projects. The Motorcycle Diaries 29 from Valparaiso, Ernesto and Alberto stowed away on a boat that was headed for the northern port of Antofagasta. They were discovered after the boat was at sea and forced to do menial chores, such as cleaning the latrines and the decks. However, at night the captain invited them to drink and play cards with him. When they arrived in Antofagasta, they tried to stow away on another boat headed farther north, but they were caught before it sailed and put on shore. Instead, they traveled north overland through the desert by hitching rides on trucks. So it was that they ended up visiting Chile's largest copper mine at Chuquicamata. On the way, they made friends with a married couple who were mine workers and members of the Chilean Communist Party. The husband told them about his 3 months in prison as a result of the Chilean government's proscription of the party and persecution of its members, and about his starving wife who followed him with exemplary loyalty, his children left in the care of a kindly neighbor, his fruitless pilgrimage in search of work, and his comrades who had mysteriously disappeared and were said to be somewhere at the bottom of the sea. Page 59. According to his diary, when Ernesto and Alberto encountered the couple, they were numb with cold, huddling together in the desert night, without a single miserable blanket to sleep under. So we gave them one of ours, and Alberto and I wrapped the other around us as best we could. Ernesto saw them as a living symbol of the proletariat the world over, and wrote that It's really upsetting to think they use repressive measures against people like these, since what motivated them to join the Communist Party was nothing more than the natural desire for a better life and their protest against persistent hunger. He observed that this motivation had led them to adopt communist ideology, whose real meaning he felt they could never grasp, but when it was translated into bread for the poor, was something that they could understand, and that gave them hope for the future. Page 60. When he and Alberto visited the huge U.S. owned open-pit copper mine at CheGuevara, they were offended by the condescending manner of the U.S. managers and the hazardous working conditions and poor pay of the Chilean mine workers. In his diary, he wrote, "The bosses, the blonde, efficient, arrogant managers told us in primitive Spanish, 'This isn't a tourist town. I'll get a guide to give you a half-hour tour around the mine, and then please be good enough to leave. We have a lot of work 30 CheGuevara to do.'" Page 60. He also noted that a strike was being planned at the mine and wrote in his diary that their guide, who he called the Yankee boss's faithful lapdog, told us, "Stupid gringos. They lose thousands of pesos every day in a strike so as not to give a poor worker a couple of extra centavos." Ernesto noted in his diary that Chile offers economic possibilities to anyone willing to work as long as he's not from the proletariat, since the country had enough mineral resources, copper, iron, coal, tin, gold, silver, manganese, nitrates, etc., to make it an industrial power. However, he observed that the main thing Chile has to do is to get its tiresome Yankee friend off its back, a Herculean task, at least for the time being, given the huge U.S. investment and the ease with which it can bring economic pressure to bear whenever its interests are threatened. Page 71. From CheGuevara, Ernesto and Alberto hitchhiked to the Peruvian border. In Peru, they adopted a pattern of hitching rides on the truck's car, rallying people and freight between the main towns, and asking if they could stay overnight in the guard stations of the Peruvian Civil Guard, the country's paramilitary national police force, or the hospitals in the towns where they stopped. As they traveled, they came in close contact with Peru's exploited and suffering Indian masses, who represent a majority of the population. They saw how the Indians of the Peruvian Altiplano, High Plateau, were, and still are, exploited and oppressed. In Tarata, Peru, Ernesto wrote in his diary about how the local Peruvian Indians, the Aymaras, are not the same proud race that time after time rose up against Inca rule and forced them to maintain a permanent army on their borders. Rather, they had become a defeated race since the Spanish conquest and centuries of colonial domination. He noted that they look at us meekly, almost fearfully, completely indifferent to the outside world, and some give the impression that they go on living simply because it's a habit they can't give up. Page 77. After they left Tarata, they traveled on the same truck with a school teacher who had been fired by the government. Because he was a member of the leftist APRA party, American Popular Revolutionary Alliance. He was part Indian and seemed to know a great deal about Peru's indigenous cultures and customs. He told Ernesto and Alberto about the animosity that exists between the Indians, whom he admired, and the mestizos, half-bloods, whom he considered wily and cowardly, even though he, the Motorcycle Diaries 31, was technically one himself. According to Ernesto, the teacher's voice took on a strange, inspired resonance whenever he spoke about his Indians, and it switched to deep despondency when he spoke of the Indians' present conditions, brutalized by modern civilization and the impure mestizos. Page 81. The teacher told Ernesto and Alberto about the need to establish schools for the Indians that would teach them to value their own world, and that would enable them to play a useful role within it. He also spoke about the need to change completely the present system of education, which he said, on the rare occasions it does offer Indians an education, that is, according to the white man's criteria, only llls them with shame and resentment, leaving them unable to help their fellow Indians and at a tremendous disadvantage in a white society, which is hostile to them. Page 81. Ernesto made frequent references in his diary to the plight of the Indians and to the injustices and discrimination they suffered at the hands of the whites and mestizos. When he and Alberto visited the magnificent Incan ruins of Machu Picchu, He also noted how the North American tourists paid little or no attention to how the Indians lived. Although he and Alberto traveled to the ruins on the third-class train, used only by the local Indians, he observed. The tourists traveling in their comfort-able rail cars can only have the very vaguest idea of how the Indians live, gleaned from a quick glance as they whiz by our train, which has to stop to let them pass. Page 101. And he later criticized how the wealthier people in Peru expected their Indian servants to carry anything heavy and put up with any discomfort. Page 108. Because of their interest in leprosy, they went to Lima, the capital city of Peru, to meet Dr. Hugo Pes, a well-known expert in leprology and a university professor. Dr. Pes put them up in the leper hospital he ran in Lima and invited them to eat dinner at his house, which they did just about every night while they stayed in Lima. They divided their time between the leper hospital and the National Museum of the Archaeology, Anthropology, and History of Peru, which presents the history of Peru from prehistoric times to the colonial era. Ernesto also had long conversations about philosophy, politics, and critical health issues in Latin America with Dr. Pes, who was a disciple of the Peruvian Marxist philosopher José Carlos Mariátegui, and 32 CheGuevara, a prominent member of the Peruvian Communist Party. Pes had been forced into political exile during the FARC years of the dictatorship of General Manuel Odría, 1948-1956, and was probably the FARC man of medicine Ernesto and Alberto had met, who was genuinely living a highly principled life and totally dedicated to serving the common good. Anderson, 1997, 85-86. In Lima, Ernesto and Alberto decided to give up their original objective of traveling to the United States. They chose Venezuela as their ultimate destination after FARC visiting Dr. Pes's largest treatment center for lepers in Peru's Amazonian region. When they were ready to leave, the patients of the leper hospital in Lima gave them an emotional send-off party. They were very touched by the affectionate farewell the patients gave them and by the small collection of money they presented them for their trip. Ernesto wrote in his diary that some had tears in their eyes as they thanked us for coming, spending time with them, accepting their presence, sitting listening to soccer on the radio with them. And he added that, if anything were to make us seriously specialize in leprosy, it would be the affection the patients show us wherever we go. Page 123. Somewhat later, in a letter he wrote to his father from Iquitos, Peru, he observed that their appreciation stemmed from the fact that we didn't wear overalls or gloves, that we shook hands with them as we would the next man, sat with them chatting about this and that, and played football with them. He added, this may seem pointless bravado, but the psychological benefit to these people, usually treated like animals, of being treated as normal human beings is incalculable, and the risk incurred ibly remote. Page 132. Their destination when they set out from Lima was the San Pablo leper colony, situated on the banks of the Amazon River. They hitchhiked from Lima to Pucallpa and then took a boat down the Ucayali River, one of the headwaters of the Amazon, to Iquitos. From Iquitos, they took another boat down the Amazon to the San Pablo leper colony. Once there, they volunteered to work in the leprosarium's laboratory and endeared themselves to both the staff and the patients. They played soccer with the patients, took them on hikes, and even led them on hunting expeditions. While they were at the colony, Ernesto turned 24, and the staff threw a birthday party for him. After he was given a touching toast by the motorcyclediaries 33 rector of the colony, Ernesto replied to the toast as expected under such circumstances. An excerpt from his account of the speech is worth quoting since it reveals his newfound Latin American identity and also what would become one of his deepest political convictions. In a few days, we will be leaving Peru, so these words are also a farewell, and I'd like to stress my gratitude to all the people of this country, who over and over again since we arrived, have shown us the warmth of their hospitality. And I would like to add another thought, nothing to do with this toast. Although we're too insignificant to be spokesmen for such a noble cause, we believe, and this journey has only served to confirm this belief, that the division of America into unstable and illusory nations is a complete fission. We are one single mestizo race with remarkable ethnographical similarities, from Mexico down to the Magellan Straits. And so, in an attempt to break free from all narrow-minded provincialism, I propose a toast to Peru and to a united America. Page 135. The speech received loud applause, and one can see in it the stirrings of his political oratory skills as well as his ultimate political mission, the political unification of Latin America. When it came time for Ernesto and Alberto to leave, some of the pa-tints gave them a very emotional farewell serenade, with a blind man singing local songs and a man with virtually no fingers playing an accordion. Alberto thanked them and said they were both deeply touched. The next day, Ernesto and Alberto went to see the patients, and after taking some photographs with them, came back with 2 large pineapples. After saying their final goodbyes, they cast off in a raft named Mambo Tango, built for them by one of the staff members, so they could go down the river to Leticia, Colombia, where the borders of Colombia, Peru, and Brazil meet on the upper Amazon. In Leticia, they got 50% off on the weekly flight to Bogotá and made some money coaching and playing for the town's soccer team. When they arrived in Bogotá, they obtained permission to stay at a hospital, where they were offered jobs in the leprosy service. However, they had a run-in with the local police over a knife Ernesto carried with him that was a present from his brother Roberto. They were harassed 34 CheGuevara so badly by the police, they decided to leave for Venezuela as soon as possible. In reference to this encounter with the Colombian police in a letter Ernesto wrote to his mother from Bogotá, he observed, "There is more repression of individual freedom here than in any country we've been to. The police patrol the streets carrying rifle-es and demand your papers every few minutes, which some of them read upside down." Page 144. He also wrote that the countryside is in open revolt and the army is powerless to put it down. "Because of this situation," he said, "we're getting out of here as soon as we can." A few days later, the 2 harassed travelers left Bogotá on a bus headed for Venezuela. They made their way to Caracas, the capital of Venezuela. Alberto looked up a doctor who was a specialist in leprology. Impressed by Alberto's interest in leprosy, the doctor offered him a position in his laboratory. At about the same time, Ernesto ran into an uncle who had an airplane that he used to transport racehorses between Buenos Aires and Miami. The uncle told Ernesto that he could return with him to Buenos Aires if he wanted to resume his studies at medical school. Ernesto and Alberto made a pact. Alberto would accept the job offered him and stay in Venezuela, while Ernesto would go back to Buenos Aires to graduate from medical school and then return to Venezuela to work with Alberto. It was the end of July 1952 when they said goodbye in Caracas. In one of the last entries in his diary, Ernesto commented on how much he missed Alberto. He said, "I'm always turning around to tell him something and then I realize he's not there." And he added, "All these months we've been together through thick and thin, and the habit of dreaming the same dreams in similar situations has made us even closer." On the other hand, the same entry makes it clear he was looking forward to going home to start my studies again and finally getting the degree which will enable me to practice medicine. Page 148. When Ernesto left Caracas, the plane he took went to Miami, where it was scheduled to stop before returning to Buenos Aires. However, when they got to Miami, the plane had mechanical problems, so it had to be repaired before it could leave for Buenos Aires. Ernesto took advantage of this opportunity to get to know the city. Pages 153-54. As it turned out, he had to wait a whole month for the plane to be repaired. He had the motorcycle diaries 35 no money, but he was able to stay in a small hotel by promising to pay the bill from Buenos Aires as soon as he returned, which he did. During the month that he stayed in Miami, Ernesto visited the beaches and hung around with an Argentine student he met, who helped him find a job as a dishwasher in one of Miami's restaurants. When the plane was repaired, he flew back to Buenos Aires. It was September 1952. In the prologue, he wrote for Ernesto's The Motorcycle Diaries. His father says we can see in this written account of Ernesto's 8-month journey that he had faith in himself as well as the will to succeed, and a tremendous determination to achieve what he set out to do. Page 4. He also recounts the observations made about Ernesto by a priest, Father Cucchetti, a friend of the family who was well known in Argentina for his liberal views. When he told him about Ernesto and Alberto's trip to the Amazon and their stay in the San Pablo leper colony, the priest said the following: "I take my hat off to your son and his friends' humanity and integrity, because to do what they did takes more than just guts. You need a will of iron and an enormously compassionate and charitable soul. Your son will go far." Page 2. The Motorcycle Diaries reveal Ernesto's growing political consciousness and his early leanings toward socialism, as he learned our rest hand during his travels of the extreme conditions of social injustice and oppression that prevail throughout Latin America. However, what is most striking about the Motorcycle Diaries is that, while they reveal he had a strong desire to help others less fortunate than himself, he did not possess the kind of self-righteousness or exaggerated piety that one often associates with zealous do-gooders and missionaries. The legendary actor, producer, and director Robert Redford produced a popular film version of the Motorcycle Diaries, which was directed by the well-known Brazilian film director Walter Salles. The film was shown in cinemas around the world during 2004 and 2005. It provides a moving account of Ernesto's journey with his friend Alberto Granado throughout Latin America. It stars the popular Mexican actor Gael Garcia Bernal as the young Ernesto, while Alberto is played by the Argentine actor Rodrigo de la Serna, who is related to Ernesto CheGuevara through his mother's side of the family. After making the film, Garcia Bernal reportedly said, "He's a person that changed the world, and he has really forced me to change the rules of what I am." Osborne 2003. 36 CheGuevara Redford traveled to Havana to obtain permission to make the film from Che's widow, Aleda March, who maintains an archive of all his writings, official papers, and information written about him. When the production of the film was completed, Redford returned to Cuba to host a special screening, which was attended by Aleda, 84-year-old Alberto Granado, Che's sons and daughters, his former comrades, and people who had worked closely with him during the early years of the Cuban Revolution. According to Redford, the film was well received by this audience, and he said later, "I could have probably died there in the seat when I heard people sniffy NG and crying, and I thought either they're so upset with me I'm not going to get out of here, or they liked the film, which they did." Smiley 2004. The film was generally well received by critics and won various awards, including one Oscar. It was not widely distributed in the United States and earned only some $16 million in the United States, while it earned over $40 million at cinemas in other parts of the world. Gael Garcia Bernal criticized the poor distribution of the film in the United States. According to the Internet Movie Database, IMDb, Garcia Bernal told an interviewer for the Detroit Free Press that the Hollywood studio system relegates pictures like the Motorcycle Diaries to limited screenings in film theaters. As a result, most people in the United States never even consider seeing them, and they do not get the chance to compete with the well-funded, mainstream Hollywood films. He said, "They get tossed off as foreign and independent films, like they are somehow not ready to compete with all that crap that Hollywood produces." Nevertheless, the film is available in DVD format and can be purchased or rented. As his diaries and the film reveals, Ernesto learned a great deal about Latin America and himself through his travels. As a young man wandering around South America, he learned to take pleasure in traveling for days on end with little or no money, without the possibility of taking a bath and changing his clothes, and not even knowing when he would eat next or where he would stay the night. The knowledge he gained from this experience of surviving on his own wits, and the personal traits he developed as a result of traveling from day to day in this manner helped prepare him for the life he would lead much later as a guerrilla fighter, when he often had to survive without food, water, bathing, or adequate clothing.